Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. It's wonderful to have you with us again as we prepare to open a new file and delve into another complex and chilling case that will challenge your perceptions. We place our ultimate trust in medical professionals, sworn to do no harm. But what happens when the hand that is supposed to heal is the one that kills? When a patient dies under a doctor's care, it's often seen as a tragic mistake. But sometimes, a closer look reveals a disturbing pattern, blurring the line between negligence and intent. It's in this gray area that we must ask the chilling question: was this a case of medical malpractice, or was it cold-blooded murder? Case 1. The Butcher of Dallas. A neurosurgeon's scalpel becomes a weapon, leaving a trail of maimed and dead patients in his wake. In the sterile, brightly lit world of the operating room, trust is the silent, unlisted instrument on every surgical tray. Patients surrender their consciousness, their bodies, their very lives to the hands of a surgeon, believing in the oath and the years of training that guide the scalpel. But the story of Christopher Dunch is a chilling testament to how that sacred trust can be corrupted, how the instruments of healing can be turned into tools of butchery, and how a system designed to protect can become a silent accomplice. His is not a simple story of a bad doctor. It is a labyrinth of ambition, narcissism, and a terrifying incompetence that left a trail of ruined lives, begging the question that echoes in the halls of justice and medicine: was this a catastrophic failure of skill, or the calculated work of a man who knew exactly the harm he was causing? Christopher Daniel Dunch entered the medical world not with a whisper, but with a roar of self-proclaimed brilliance. Born in Montana and raised in a suburb of Memphis, Tennessee, he was a man of immense ambition. He pursued and achieved both an MD and a PhD through a prestigious program at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. On paper, he was a paragon of medical achievement. He was involved in multiple companies, held patents, and authored complex papers on stem cell research. He presented himself as a visionary, a pioneer on the cutting edge of neurosurgery, destined to revolutionize the field. He was charismatic, confident, and utterly convincing. When he arrived in Dallas, Texas, in 2011, he was seen as a star acquisition for the medical community, a surgeon who could attract wealth, prestige, and complex cases to any hospital that employed him. Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano, now known as Baylor Scott and White Medical Center Plano, was the first to welcome him. They gave him a lucrative contract, starting at $600,000 a year and the full privileges of a spine surgeon. He was, by all appearances, the total package. His colleagues, however, began to see a different picture almost immediately. In the operating room, away from the polished resume and the confident sales pitch, another Dunch emerged. This Dunch was clumsy, erratic, and dangerously unorthodox. Seasoned surgical nurses and fellow doctors watched in disbelief as he committed errors that a first-year resident would be expected to avoid. He seemed to lack a fundamental understanding of anatomy, a cardinal sin for a neurosurgeon whose work is measured in millimeters and whose mistakes can mean the difference between walking and paralysis, between life and death. One of his first patients at Baylor Plano was a man named Lee Passmore. Passmore had come in for a routine spinal fusion, a common procedure to alleviate back pain. Under Dunch's knife, the routine became a nightmare. Dr. Mark Hoyle, another surgeon in the operating room, watched in horror as Dunch operated. Dunch, according to Hoyle, seemed to misidentify parts of the patient's anatomy and conducted the surgery with a shocking lack of care. A screw was misplaced, causing Passmore immense pain and permanent mobility issues. But more disturbingly, a ligament essential for stability was removed for no discernible medical reason. It was, in the words of another surgeon who later reviewed the case, as if he simply did not know what he was doing. This was not an isolated incident. The whispers in the operating rooms and recovery wards at Baylor Plano grew louder. Another surgeon, Dr. Randall Kirby, who assisted Dunch on a procedure, was so appalled by what he witnessed that he physically intervened to stop Dunch from causing further harm. Kirby described Dunch's technique as that of a novice. He saw him using instruments incorrectly, dissecting through muscle tissue with a brute force that was antithetical to the delicate nature of spinal surgery. He saw a man dangerously out of his depth, yet brimming with a confidence that bordered on delusion. Kirby would later call him a sociopath and state that it was like watching a child play with Tinker toys. The concern was not just about his surgical skill, or lack thereof. There were unsettling rumors about his personal life. Allegations of drug and alcohol abuse, including cocaine and LSD, swirled around him. An email he sent to a former girlfriend, which would later become a centerpiece of the legal case against him, was a terrifying window into a disturbed mind. In it, he wrote, "I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience. I am ready to become a cold-blooded killer." While perhaps written in a fit of personal rage, the words would take on a sinister, prophetic meaning in light of what was happening in his operating room. The hospital was now faced with a problem. They had a surgeon who was a walking, talking liability. Yet, the process of removing a doctor is fraught with legal and financial peril. A formal dismissal or the revocation of privileges could lead to lawsuits and damage the hospital's pristine reputation. So, Baylor Plano took a different route. They allowed Christopher Dunch to quietly resign. He left not with the mark of censure on his record, but with a letter from the hospital that did not mention the litany of botched surgeries. It was a clean break, a passing of the problem. This single act of institutional self-preservation would have catastrophic consequences, as it allowed a predator in a white coat to move on, his record deceptively clean, ready to hunt for new victims at a new institution. Dunch's best friend, Jerry Summers, became one of those victims. Summers had been in a car accident and trusted Dunch to perform surgery on his neck. He went into the operating room as a friend, believing he was in the safest hands possible. He woke up a quadriplegic. During the procedure, Dunch had operated on the wrong part of the spine, removing so much bone that Summers' head was no longer stable on his neck. He severed an artery, causing massive bleeding that he packed with so much coagulant that it compressed Summers' spinal cord, starving it of blood and rendering him unable to move from the neck down. Summers would later say from his wheelchair, his voice a whisper, that he considered Dunch his brother. The betrayal was absolute. After leaving Baylor Plano, Christopher Dunch, armed with his unblemished letter of recommendation, easily obtained privileges at Dallas Medical Center. It was here that his trail of destruction accelerated, moving from maiming to killing. The hospital, eager for a productive spine surgeon, had failed to do a thorough background check. They did not call his previous colleagues at Baylor Plano. They simply looked at the paperwork, and the paperwork looked fine. In July 2012, a 55-year-old schoolteacher named Kelly Martin came to Dallas Medical Center for a minor back surgery, a microdiscectomy. She was nervous, as anyone would be, but she trusted her doctor. She trusted the system. After the surgery, Dunch claimed it had been a success. But in the recovery room, Martin began to cry out in excruciating pain. Nurses noted her deteriorating condition, her dropping blood pressure. She was losing a massive amount of blood, but the source was unclear. Dunch was reportedly calm, almost dismissive of the growing panic around him. It was only after she had bled out, after she was gone, that another surgeon examining the wound discovered the truth. Dunch had sliced a major artery. It was a catastrophic and entirely preventable error. Kelly Martin had bled to death in her hospital bed following what should have been a simple, low-risk procedure. Her death was ruled an accident, a known complication of surgery. But for those who were paying attention, it was part of a terrifying pattern. Just 1 month later, in August 2012, Floella Brown, 64, was wheeled into Dunch's operating room at Dallas Medical Center. She was seeking relief from neck pain. The surgery was scheduled to be a 2-level cervical fusion. What happened in that room was another storm of incompetence. Dunch drilled a screw into her vertebral artery, the main blood supply to the brain. The artery was shredded. The bleeding was immense. Floella Brown had a massive stroke on the operating table. She was left brain dead, her life sustained only by machines. Her family, who had sent her to the hospital for help, now had to make the agonizing decision to turn off the ventilator and let her go. 2 deaths, multiple paralyzing injuries, a string of maimed patients, and still, he continued. He moved on from Dallas Medical Center, this time with his privileges revoked, but the damage was done. He found a temporary position at a surgical center called Legacy Surgery Center in Frisco, which later became University General Hospital Dallas. It was here he operated on Mary Efford, a 74-year-old grandmother. She woke from her surgery in a state of unimaginable agony. "I felt like he had tried to kill me," she would later testify. An investigation by another surgeon, Dr. Robert Henderson, revealed the full extent of the horror. Dunch had completely botched the fusion. He had amputated a nerve root, leaving her with permanent nerve damage and unrelenting pain. He had left hardware floating in her muscle tissue, drilled holes in the wrong places, and fused bones that should never have been touched. It was, in Dr. Henderson's words, as if Dunch had no concept of the anatomy he was operating on. Dr. Henderson was a veteran neurosurgeon, a man who had seen it all. But what he saw in the scans of Dunch's patients chilled him to the bone. This wasn't just malpractice. It wasn't just a string of mistakes. To Henderson, it looked intentional. The damage was too precise, too wrong, too consistently destructive to be accidental. It was as if Dunch was a vandal, deliberately destroying the delicate architecture of the human spine. Dr. Henderson, along with Dr. Randall Kirby, the surgeon who had been horrified by Dunch at Baylor Plano, decided they could no longer rely on the hospital systems or the slow-turning wheels of the medical board. They became relentless crusaders, determined to stop Dunch before he could harm anyone else. They wrote letters, made phone calls, and compiled extensive reports detailing every botched surgery, every maimed patient, every inexplicable error. They sent their findings to the Texas Medical Board, the state agency responsible for licensing and disciplining doctors. Their pleas, however, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The Texas Medical Board was notoriously slow and, some argued, overly protective of its physicians. For months, as Henderson and Kirby frantically tried to raise the alarm, Dunch was still a licensed physician. He even managed to get privileges at one more facility, University General Hospital, where he operated on Jeff Glidewell. During what should have been a straightforward neck fusion, Dunch sliced Glidewell's esophagus, severed a vocal cord, and cut an artery, leaving a surgical sponge embedded in the wound. Glidewell was left with the hole in his throat, unable to speak above a whisper and fighting a life-threatening infection. It was only the intervention of another surgeon who rushed Glidewell into an emergency procedure that saved his life. Finally, in June 2013, after an agonizingly long delay and a trail of at least 33 brutalized patients in less than 2 years, the Texas Medical Board suspended Christopher Dunch's medical license. It was revoked permanently in December of that year. The reign of Dr. Death, as the media would soon dub him, was over. But the story was far from finished. For the victims and their families, the revocation of his license was not enough. They had lost loved ones, their ability to walk, to work, to live without pain. They wanted justice. And the Dallas County District Attorney's Office decided to give it to them in a way that had never been done before. Typically, a case like this would be handled in civil court through malpractice lawsuits. But prosecutors, led by a determined assistant district attorney named Michelle Sugart, saw something more sinister in Dunch's actions. They saw a crime. They believed his hands, guiding a scalpel, were no different from a person's hands wielding a knife in an alley. They made a groundbreaking decision to charge Christopher Dunch not with malpractice, but with a first-degree felony, injury to an elderly person, specifically for his butchering of Mary Efford. It was a novel legal strategy, essentially arguing that the operating room had been transformed into a crime scene. The trial, which began in early 2017, was a grim parade of the lives Dunch had destroyed. One by one, survivors took the stand, their bodies and voices bearing testament to his handiwork. Jerry Summers testified via video, a man trapped in a paralyzed body, a living monument to his friend's betrayal. Mary Efford, the elderly woman at the center of the case, detailed her constant, searing pain. Doctors Henderson and Kirby provided expert testimony, explaining to the jury in excruciating detail the almost unbelievable series of errors Dunch had made, arguing that they went far beyond mere incompetence into the realm of knowing, reckless assault. The prosecution painted a picture of a narcissist, a con man who had faked his way into the highest echelons of medicine. They presented evidence of his drug use, his financial desperation, and his chilling email where he claimed to be ready to become a cold-blooded killer. They argued that he knew he was incompetent but continued to operate anyway, driven by ego and money, showing a depraved indifference to human life. Dunch's defense argued that he was simply a bad surgeon, not a criminal. They claimed the case belonged in civil court, that this was a tragic but not malicious series of events, a result of poor training and a lack of oversight. They tried to portray him as a scapegoat for a failed system. But the evidence was overwhelming. The sheer number of victims, the consistency of the brutal errors, and the testimony of his fellow surgeons created an undeniable picture. On February 14, 2017, the jury found Christopher Dunch guilty. A week later, he was sentenced to life in prison. He became the first doctor in American history to be convicted of a felony and imprisoned for acts committed during surgery. The verdict was a landmark moment, a declaration that the protection of a white coat is not absolute. But it does not entirely close the file on Christopher Dunch. The question of his motive remains a dark, unsettling void. Was he a deeply incompetent man whose narcissism prevented him from seeing his own failings? Was he a drug addict whose mind and motor skills were so compromised that he could no longer perform his duties? Or was he something far more sinister, a true sociopath who understood the harm he was causing and, for some unknowable reason, reveled in it? The story of Christopher Dunch is ultimately a story of multiple failures. The failure of a man who betrayed his oath. The failure of prestigious medical programs to properly vet their candidates. The failure of hospitals that chose to protect their reputation over their patients. And the failure of a state medical board that acted too slowly, allowing a monster to continue his rampage. He was the weapon, but the system loaded the gun and pointed him at his victims. His case serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that the greatest danger may not be the disease, but the very person entrusted to provide the cure. It forces us to look into the bright lights of the operating theater and acknowledge the terrifying shadow that can sometimes fall there, where the line between malpractice and murder becomes terrifyingly and tragically blurred. Case 2. The Poisonous Pilgrim. A charming doctor travels across continents, leaving a legacy not of healing, but of silent, inexplicable death. Some monsters do not wear their malevolence on their faces. They wear stethoscopes, clean white coats, and expressions of practiced compassion. They are welcomed into the most vulnerable moments of our lives, their presence a symbol of hope and expertise. The story of Michael Swango is the story of such a monster, a man who perverted the very essence of the medical profession. He was not a clumsy butcher like Christopher Dunch. His evil was more insidious, a quiet poison slipped into the veins of the unsuspecting. He was a medical pilgrim, traveling from hospital to hospital, city to city, and eventually continent to continent. And everywhere he went, he left behind a wake of inexplicable, silent death, protected by a charming smile and a system that repeatedly refused to believe the unthinkable. Joseph Michael Swango's journey into darkness began with a seemingly bright and promising start. Born in 1954 and raised in Quincy, Illinois, he was an exceptional student, graduating as valedictorian of his high school class. He served with distinction in the Marine Corps before enrolling at Quincy College, where he graduated summa cum laude. His path seemed destined for prestige and service. When he was accepted into the Southern Illinois University, SIU, School of Medicine, no one would have suspected the chilling fascinations that churned beneath his polished exterior. Even in medical school, there were subtle but disturbing signs. While his peers were engrossed in anatomy and pharmacology, Swango displayed a morbid curiosity, with agonal breathing, the gasping, labored breaths of the dying, and a fixation on violent death. For a scrapbook project, instead of collecting articles on medical breakthroughs, he meticulously compiled clippings about car crashes, murders, and disasters. It was dismissed as a macabre quirk, the gallows humor common among those who regularly confront mortality. But it was a symptom of a deeper pathology, a rehearsal for a career that would be dedicated not to preserving life, but to studying its extinguishment firsthand. The first clear, undeniable pattern emerged during his surgical internship at Ohio State University, OSU, Medical Center in 1983. Swango was assigned to the neurosurgery floor, a place of high stakes and fragile lives. Soon after his arrival, a disturbing trend began. Patients who were stable, even recovering, would suddenly and inexplicably suffer cardiac or respiratory arrest. The incidents were so frequent and so often occurred when Swango was on duty that the nurses began to whisper. They called it being Swangoed. One nurse, Rena Cooper, became particularly alarmed. She noticed that time and time again, a patient would be fine one moment, and then the next, after a visit from the handsome, attentive Dr. Swango, they would be fighting for their life. He always seemed to be the first to discover the patient in distress, the first to call the code, a calm presence in the ensuing chaos. In February 1984, the whispers turned into a formal suspicion. A 69-year-old patient named Renee Donnell was recovering well from surgery. Swango was seen entering her room, and moments later, she suffered a sudden, violent respiratory arrest. A code team rushed in and managed to save her. Later, Donnell, still groggy, told another nurse a chilling story. She said Dr. Swango had injected something into her foreline just before she stopped breathing. An investigation was launched. When questioned, Swango was calm and plausible. He claimed he had simply flushed her fore with water, a routine procedure. His supervisors, perhaps unwilling to believe one of their own could be capable of such a thing, accepted his explanation. The investigation was closed. But the incidents continued. Another patient, Richard DeLong, was found dead in his hospital bed. He was a healthy patient in for routine tests. An autopsy was inconclusive. Yet another, Cynthia N. McGee, a young woman recovering from a car accident, died after Swango predicted to a nurse that she wouldn't make it through a shift, despite her stable condition. The sheer number of unexplained emergencies on his watch was statistically impossible to ignore. OSU officials finally conducted a more thorough internal review. They found the evidence against him circumstantial, but deeply troubling. However, instead of firing him and reporting him to law enforcement and licensing boards, they chose a path of quiet removal. They allowed Michael Swango to finish his internship in June 1984, but did not offer him a residency position for the following year. A damning letter from the dean explicitly stated their suspicions that he had been responsible for patient illnesses and even deaths, but this letter was not widely circulated. Once again, a medical institution, faced with a potential monster in its ranks, chose to pass the problem along. Unemployed and with a tarnished, albeit privately held, reputation in Ohio, Swango returned to his hometown of Quincy, Illinois. Unable to practice medicine without a full license, he took a job as an emergency medical technician, EMT, with the Adams County Ambulance Service. He was no longer a doctor, but he was still on the front lines, still close to the life-and-death drama he seemed to crave. And the pattern began again. His fellow paramedics started to notice something strange. After sharing coffee or donuts that Swango brought to the station, they would be struck by sudden, violent stomach illnesses. The symptoms were debilitating: nausea, vomiting, cramping. It happened again and again. At first, it was dismissed as food poisoning or a stomach bug. But the illnesses were too severe, too consistent. One paramedic became so ill he required hospitalization. The suspicion that had followed Swango from Ohio now took root in Quincy. His colleagues began to suspect he was poisoning them. The Quincy Police Department began a quiet investigation. They obtained a search warrant for Swango's apartment. What they found was a poisoner's toolkit. They discovered jars of arsenic, ant poison, and various other toxic chemicals. They also found recipes for poisons, including ricin, scrawled on index cards. The evidence was irrefutable. In October 1985, Michael Swango was arrested. Not for murder, but for aggravated battery for poisoning his coworkers. During his trial, the full, disturbing picture of Swango's psyche began to emerge. Prosecutors presented the evidence from his apartment, his morbid scrapbooks, and the testimony of the paramedics he had sickened. The stories from Ohio State University of the patients who died on his watch were also introduced to establish a pattern of behavior. The community that had once celebrated him as a valedictorian now looked on in horror. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. For any rational observer, this should have been the end of Michael Swango's medical career. A doctor, a man who had taken the Hippocratic Oath, was a convicted felon for poisoning people. His name should have been permanently red-flagged by every medical board and hospital in the country. But the system's capacity for failure was far from exhausted. After serving just 2 years of his 5-year sentence, Swango was released. He was a free man and, incredibly, he was determined to practice medicine again. He began a relentless campaign to rebuild his life, a campaign built on lies and deception. He legally changed his name to Daniel J. Adams and began applying for residency programs across the country. On his applications, he brazenly lied about his conviction, claiming it was for a minor scuffle after a bar fight, not for poisoning 6 people. Unbelievably, it worked. In 1991, the University of South Dakota, USD, School of Medicine offered him a spot in their residency program at a hospital in Sioux Falls. The hospital's administrators later claimed they were unaware of his full criminal history, a staggering admission of failed due diligence. Once again, Michael Swango had a white coat and access to vulnerable patients. His time in South Dakota was short, but it was marked by his signature charm and, for those paying attention, his sinister undercurrent. He began a relationship with a nurse, Kristen Kinney. She was captivated by his intelligence and charisma, unaware of the darkness he concealed. Swango, however, was eventually exposed. Dr. Robert Priebe, a dean at USD, received an anonymous tip and did what the hospital should have done in the first place: a thorough background check. When he discovered the truth about the poisoning conviction in Illinois, he fired Swango immediately. But the damage was done. Swango and Kristen Kinney moved together to Virginia, where he found work at a laboratory. The relationship grew more intense and also more volatile. Kinney began to suffer from mysterious, excruciating headaches and other strange ailments. She saw multiple doctors, but no one could diagnose the cause. In July 1993, after a fight with Swango, Kristen Kinney was found dead in their apartment. Her death was ruled a suicide. She had apparently taken a massive overdose of antidepressants. But her family was deeply suspicious. They knew Swango had been a controlling and manipulative partner. They knew he had a history of poisoning. They found a syringe in the trash. They pleaded with authorities to investigate Swango for murder, but their cries went unheeded. The official cause of death remained suicide. Years later, investigators would find trace amounts of arsenic in her exhumed remains, suggesting her suicide was, in fact, a carefully staged murder. With Kinney gone, and with his options in the United States dwindling, Swango set his sights on a new beginning. He applied for and was accepted into a psychiatric residency program at the State University of New York, SUNY, at Stony Brook on Long Island. Once again, he lied on his application. Once again, the hospital failed to uncover his criminal past. He started work at the Veterans Affairs, VA, Medical Center in Northport, a facility affiliated with Stony Brook, in July 1993. It was at the Northport VA that Swango's murderous spree reached its most prolific and chilling phase. Here, he had access to elderly and infirm patients, men who had served their country and were now in the care of a man who saw them as mere objects for his lethal experiments. The pattern was horribly familiar. Patients who were stable would die suddenly. A patient named Aldo Sarini was admitted for pneumonia. He was recovering, but after an encounter with Swango, he became paralyzed and died. Thomas Samarco, another patient, checked in for routine observation. Swango injected him with something that caused him to go into convulsions. He died shortly thereafter. Baron Harris, a 60-year-old cancer patient, was also killed by a fatal injection. The deaths were often attributed to the patient's underlying conditions. They were old. They were sick. Death was not unexpected. Swango moved through the wards like a ghost, his actions unnoticed, his motives hidden behind a mask of professionalism. But again, a few dedicated colleagues began to grow suspicious. A nurse noted the alarming correlation between Swango's presence and patient deaths. A supervising physician, Dr. Wayne K. Liker, became concerned by Swango's detached and unusual behavior. The dean of Stony Brook's medical school at the time was Dr. Jordan Cohen. When he was finally alerted to the litany of lies on Swango's application, the felony conviction, the dismissal from USDHE, was horrified. He immediately suspended Swango and launched an investigation. He contacted law enforcement and every hospital Swango had ever been associated with. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a terrifying picture that spanned a decade and multiple states. The FBI opened a file on him. The VA launched its own criminal investigation. The net was finally, slowly, beginning to close around Michael Swango in the United States. But the poisonous pilgrim was one step ahead. Before he could be arrested, he fled the country. Using forged documents and letters of recommendation, he secured a position at the Nene Mission Hospital in a remote part of Zimbabwe in 1994. He had escaped the reach of American justice and found a new hunting ground, a place with fewer resources and less oversight, where his crimes would be even harder to detect. For a time, he was a model physician in Africa. The staff at NIN were grateful for the help of a trained American doctor. But it wasn't long before the familiar pattern emerged. Patients at the mission hospital began to die at an alarming rate. They would be admitted with minor ailments and die of sudden, inexplicable causes. The local doctors, led by a physician named Dr. Zashiri, noticed that the death toll on the wards spiked whenever Dr. Swango was on duty. They conducted their own quiet investigation and discovered he had been lying about his credentials. They confronted him and fired him. The Zimbabwean authorities issued a warrant for his arrest for poisoning at least 7 patients, but Swango had already vanished. He fled to neighboring Zambia and then to Namibia, working odd jobs, trying to stay ahead of the law. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the case against him was solidifying. The FBI, led by dedicated agents, and the VA investigators had pieced together his entire dark journey. They had exhumed bodies, including Kristen Kinney's, and found evidence of poison. They had a federal warrant for his arrest, not for murder, but for the one charge they knew they could make stick immediately: defrauding the government by lying on his VA application. They put out an international alert for his capture. The end came in June 1997. Michael Swango, the man who had eluded justice for over a decade, made a fatal mistake. He boarded a plane in Zambia, bound for Saudi Arabia, where he had, incredibly, secured another medical job. The plane had a layover at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. As soon as he stepped onto American soil, immigration agents flagged his passport. Federal agents were waiting. The poisonous pilgrim's journey was over. He was arrested, calmly, and without incident. While in custody for the fraud charges, prosecutors in both New York and Ohio worked tirelessly to build murder cases against him. They had the forensic evidence, the testimony of his colleagues, and the chilling statistical data that followed him everywhere he went. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty, Michael Swango finally surrendered. In a courtroom in 2000, he pleaded guilty. He admitted to administering fatal injections to 3 patients at the Northport VA and to the aggravated murder of Cynthia and McGee in Ohio back in 1984. He also admitted to the manslaughter of Kristen Kinney, finally giving her family a small measure of justice. As part of his plea deal, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Zimbabwean authorities, who also wanted him for trial, eventually dropped their extradition request, knowing he would never be a free man again. Michael Swango admitted to 4 murders, but no one believes that is the true number. The FBI believes he may be responsible for as many as 60 deaths, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Dozens of other deaths in Ohio, Illinois, and Zimbabwe bear his signature, but could never be definitively proven in court. The case of Michael Swango is a profound indictment of systemic failure. It is a story of how charm can be a more effective weapon than any scalpel or poison. He exploited the very nature of the medical profession, its inherent trust, its hierarchical structure, its reluctance to admit to its own mistakes. He was passed from one institution to another like a dirty secret, each one failing to sound the alarm loudly enough to stop him. He is a testament to the chilling reality that the title doctor can be a cloak for the darkest of intentions, and that behind a healer's smile can lurk the cold, calculating eyes of a killer who has found the perfect place to hide his crimes. The user has input 1, which is the signal to continue from the previous turn. I will now provide the script for case 2. My apologies, I see my previous response was for case 2. The user's input 1 was likely a typo and intended to be 2, to continue the sequence, or they are re-requesting the second story. To avoid confusion and maintain the flow, I will proceed with the next case in the agreed-upon sequence, which is case 3. If this is incorrect, please let me know. Case 3. The Angel of Death's Lullaby. In a pediatric ward, a nurse's need for control turns a place of healing into a hunting ground for the most vulnerable. There is a unique and sacred silence in a pediatric intensive care unit, a silence punctuated only by the rhythmic hum and soft beeps of machines that breathe and beat for tiny bodies. It is a world of hushed prayers and fierce hope, where parents hand over their most precious treasures to the care of strangers in scrubs. The nurse is the guardian at the bedside, the constant presence, the voice of calm in a storm of fear. They are seen as angels of mercy, their touch a promise of comfort and healing. But this story is about an angel whose wings cast a dark shadow, a nurse whose lullaby was a prelude to a nightmare. This is the story of Janine Jones, and how her desperate need for validation turned a place of sanctuary into her own private laboratory, where the subjects were infants and the experiments were exercises in life and, all too often, death. Janine Jones was not, by any accounts, a standout figure. Born in Texas in 1950, she was a beautician before she found her calling in nursing. She became a licensed vocational nurse, LVN, in 1977, a role that placed her directly in the heart of patient care, though with less autonomy than a registered nurse, RN. She was described by those who knew her as loud, opinionated, and often difficult to work with. She craved attention, fabricating stories about her personal life and exaggerating her professional accomplishments. But in the hierarchical world of a hospital, she found a stage. And in the newly opened Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU, at Behar County Medical Center in San Antonio, she found her perfect hunting ground. When Jones began working in the PICU in the late 1970s, she appeared to be a dedicated, if somewhat overbearing, nurse. She was always willing to take on extra shifts, especially the dreaded 3 to 11 p.m. death shift, so named because it was a time when patient conditions often worsened and staff was stretched thin. But soon, that nickname took on a terrifyingly literal meaning. An epidemic began in the Behar County PICU, a silent, unseen plague. Children who were recovering, children on the verge of being discharged, would suddenly and catastrophically crash. They would stop breathing, suffer violent seizures, or begin bleeding from needle puncture sites for no discernible reason. A code blue would be called, and the quiet ward would erupt into controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses would rush to the bedside, a frantic flurry of life-saving measures. And at the center of this drama, almost every single time, was Janine Jones. She was often the first to notice the child was in distress, the one to sound the alarm. She would be right there, assisting doctors, calling out vital signs, seemingly a pillar of strength and competence in the face of tragedy. Sometimes, through the heroic efforts of the medical team, the child would be pulled back from the brink. Jones would be praised for her quick thinking and vigilance. But many times they were not so lucky. The child would die. The other nurses began to whisper. It was too much to be a coincidence. The sheer number of emergencies and deaths occurring on Jones's watch was staggering. They started tracking it themselves, marking calendars, noting which nurse was assigned to which child. The pattern was undeniable. When Janine Jones was on duty, children were in peril. When she was off, the ward was peaceful. Her 3 to 11 shift became a source of palpable dread among her colleagues. They would pray that no child would be admitted during those hours, that the ones already there would make it through to the morning. One of the first to raise a serious alarm was a fellow nurse named Susanna Maldonado. She noticed that vials of heparin, a powerful anticoagulant, and succinylcholine, a fast-acting muscle relaxant, seemed to be tampered with or used up at an alarming rate during Jones's shifts. Succinylcholine, in particular, was a terrifyingly perfect weapon. When injected into a patient, it paralyzes every muscle in the body, including the diaphragm. The victim is fully conscious but unable to breathe, suffocating in a state of absolute terror. It is also notoriously difficult to detect in the body after death, as it metabolizes very quickly. It was a poison that left almost no trace. Maldonado and other nurses took their concerns to the hospital administration. They presented their informal data, their fears, their absolute conviction that something was terribly wrong. But they were met with resistance, with disbelief, and with institutional denial. The implications were monstrous. To admit that a nurse was intentionally harming and possibly killing children would create a scandal of unimaginable proportions. It would destroy the hospital's reputation and open it up to a torrent of lawsuits. The administration chose to see it as a statistical anomaly, a string of bad luck. They questioned the motives of the accusing nurses, suggesting it was professional jealousy. The complaints were dismissed. The angel was given the benefit of the doubt, and the dying continued. The hospital did eventually conduct an internal inquiry, led by a hospital physician. The findings were chilling. The inquiry confirmed that a child was 25 times more likely to have a medical emergency when Janine Jones was on duty. Yet, even with this damning statistical evidence, no action was taken against her. The hospital did, however, take a different kind of action. They began quietly phasing out the LVN position in the PICU, replacing them with more highly trained RNs. It was a passive-aggressive way of solving the problem. In March 1982, Janine Jones, along with several other LVNs, was let go. She was not fired for cause. She was not reported to the Board of Nursing or to law enforcement. She was simply given a letter of recommendation and sent on her way, a loaded weapon being passed into an unsuspecting community. Jones quickly found a new job in a small, private pediatric clinic in the town of Kerrville, Texas, about an hour's drive from San Antonio. The clinic was run by Dr. Kathleen Holland, a physician who was thrilled to have a nurse with extensive PICU experience. In Kerrville, there was no large team of doctors and nurses, no hospital bureaucracy to hide behind. It was just Dr. Holland, Janine Jones, and their small, trusting patients. The compressed environment would make Jones's actions impossible to ignore. In August 1982, a mother named Petty McClellan brought her 15-month-old daughter, Chelsea, to Dr. Holland's clinic for routine immunizations. Chelsea was a bright, happy, perfectly healthy toddler. Jones administered the shots. A short while later, as Petty was getting ready to leave, Chelsea stopped breathing. Jones rushed into action, initiating CPR, yelling for an ambulance. She was once again the hero at the center of the crisis. Chelsea was rushed to the nearby Sid Peterson Memorial Hospital, where she was stabilized and seemed to be recovering. The next day, Jones visited Chelsea in the hospital. She told Petty McClellan that she needed to administer another injection. She shooed the mother out of the room. Moments later, Chelsea suffered a massive, violent seizure and went into full cardiac arrest. This time, she could not be saved. Chelsea McClellan, a healthy child who had walked into a clinic for routine shots, was dead. Dr. Holland was devastated and deeply suspicious. A healthy child does not die from routine immunizations. Her mind raced back over the past few months. She realized that since Jones had started working at her clinic, she had seen an unprecedented number of medical emergencies. Children would come in for simple checkups and end up in the emergency room. She recalled finding puncture marks on a vial of succinylcholine that should have been sealed. The vial was not supposed to be in her clinic at all. She had never ordered it. Jones had brought it with her from her time at the Behar County Hospital. Dr. Holland's suspicion turned into a horrifying certainty. She contacted the Kerr County Sheriff's Office and shared her fears. She told them about Chelsea, about the other emergencies, and about the punctured vial of succinylcholine. This time, the alarm was heard. An investigation was launched, led by a determined prosecutor named Ron Sutton. Sutton and his team faced an immense challenge. They had to prove that Jones had not only injected Chelsea with a fatal dose of succinylcholine, but that she had done so with the intent to kill. The biggest hurdle was forensic. Succinylcholine was believed to be untraceable after death. Investigators made frantic calls to labs across the country. They finally found a toxicology lab in Sweden that had developed a novel technique for detecting the drug's metabolites in tissue samples. They exhumed Chelsea McClellan's tiny body and sent tissue samples across the Atlantic. The results came back positive. They had found the murder weapon. The investigation then widened, looking back at her time in San Antonio. Prosecutors began the grim task of untangling the web of death at the Behar County PICU. They spoke with the nurses who had tried to sound the alarm years earlier. They uncovered the hospital's internal report with its damning statistics. A grand jury was convened, and in October 1983, Janine Jones was indicted for the murder of Chelsea McClellan. She was also indicted for injury to another child, Rolando Santos, whom she had injected with a massive, nearly fatal dose of heparin. The trial, in 1984, captured the nation's attention. The prosecution, led by Sutton, meticulously laid out their case. They argued that Janine Jones was not an angel of mercy, but a narcissist with a hero complex. She created the life-threatening emergencies so that she could be the one to save the day, to earn the praise and attention she so desperately craved. When the children died, it was an unfortunate outcome, but the drama itself was the goal. They presented the evidence of the succinylcholine, the testimony of Dr. Holland, and the powerful, emotional accounts from the nurses of the death shift. Jones's defense attorneys argued that she was a scapegoat, a victim of a witch hunt orchestrated by jealous colleagues and a hospital desperate to cover up its own inadequacies. They claimed the deaths were tragic coincidences, the result of a high-risk medical environment. Jones herself maintained her innocence, portraying herself as a dedicated nurse who was being persecuted for caring too much. The jury was not convinced. The evidence, particularly the exhumation of Chelsea McClellan and the discovery of the poison, was too powerful to ignore. They found Janine Jones guilty of the murder of Chelsea McClellan. She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Shortly after, she was convicted for injuring Rolando Santos and given a concurrent 60-year sentence. The Angel of Death was finally caged. But the story has a final, chilling chapter. At the time of her conviction, Texas had a law on the books called the Mandatory Release Law. It was designed to alleviate prison overcrowding by automatically granting parole to inmates who had accrued enough good time credit once their calendar time served plus their good time equaled their total sentence length. Because of the way the law was written, it applied even to violent offenders and murderers like Janine Jones. In an almost unbelievable failure of the justice system, it was calculated that the child killer, sentenced to 99 years, would be mandatorily released from prison on March 1, 2018, after serving only a third of her sentence. When the families of her victims, the prosecutors, and the public became aware of this impending release, there was outrage. The thought of this woman walking free was unbearable. A new generation of prosecutors in Behar County, led by then District Attorney Nicola Hood, felt a moral obligation to act. They could not undo the mandatory release law, but they could try to ensure she never left prison. They formed a task force with a single mission: to find enough evidence to convict Janine Jones of another one of the dozens of murders she was suspected of committing during her time at the Behar County PICU. It was a frantic race against time. Investigators reopened cold cases from more than 30 years prior. They dug through dusty hospital records, re-interviewed nurses and doctors, and spoke to parents who had spent decades living with the unanswered questions surrounding their children's deaths. They focused on several highly suspicious cases, children whose sudden deaths had always pointed to Jones. In May 2017, less than a year before her scheduled release, the task force succeeded. A grand jury indicted Janine Jones for the September 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, who died after being injected with a toxic dose of the anti-seizure drug Dilantin. A month later, she was indicted for the murder of 8-month-old Rosemary Vega. Over the next few months, more indictments followed for the murders of other infants. Each new indictment was a brick in the wall being built around her, ensuring that even if the state of Texas was forced to release her from her 1984 sentence, she would simply be transferred to another jail to await trial for her other alleged crimes. She would die in prison. The story of Janine Jones is not about a single act of evil, but about a sustained campaign of terror waged against the most defenseless among us. It is a story about a profound psychological sickness and need for attention so powerful it eclipsed the value of human life. But it is also, once again, a story of systemic failure. A failure of a hospital to listen to its own staff, a failure to protect its patients over its reputation, and a failure of the justice system that nearly allowed a monster to walk free. The lullaby she offered was a lie, a soothing sound to cover the sharp sting of the needle. And for dozens of families, the silence that followed was the sound of a trust so completely and devastatingly broken that it could never be repaired. Case 4. The doctor's final house call. A trusted family physician becomes Britain's most prolific serial killer, hiding his crimes behind a veil of compassion. Trust in a small town is not a commodity. It is the very bedrock of the community. It is built over years, through shared experiences, quiet greetings on the street, and the steady presence of familiar faces. In the market town of Hyde, Greater Manchester, no face was more familiar or more trusted than that of Dr. Harold Shipman. He was the quintessential family doctor, an old-fashioned general practitioner, GP, from a bygone era. He made house calls, he remembered the names of his patients' children, and he listened with a patient, reassuring air. To his nearly 3,000 patients, he was more than a doctor. He was a confidant, a pillar of the community, a man they welcomed into their homes at their most vulnerable moments. This profound trust was his greatest tool. And it was the cloak under which he became the most prolific serial killer in British history. Harold Frederick Shipman, born in 1946 in Nottingham, did not have the ostentatious ambition of a Christopher Dunch or the slick charm of a Michael Swango. His evil was quiet, methodical, and chillingly domestic. He was a product of a working-class background, a bright student who attended Leeds School of Medicine. His early career gave a small, overlooked hint of the darkness to come. As a junior doctor in Pontefract, he became addicted to the opioid painkiller pethidine, forging prescriptions for himself. He was caught, fined, and sent to a drug rehabilitation clinic. In an astonishing lapse of oversight, the General Medical Council, GMC, the UK's medical regulatory body, gave him little more than a warning. The incident was noted and then effectively forgotten. By 1977, he was a practicing GP in Hyde, his past a sealed file, his future a blank slate upon which he would write a legacy of death. For over 2 decades, Shipman built his practice and his reputation. He was known as good old Dr. Shipman. He worked tirelessly, his days filled with appointments and house calls, primarily to the town's elderly population. And his elderly patients, particularly women who lived alone, began to die. It was not at first alarming. They were old, many were frail. Death is the natural conclusion of life. Shipman was always there, at the bedside, to comfort the family, sign the death certificate, and handle the sad formalities. He would often be the last person to see them alive. The cause of death was invariably listed as old age or a plausible ailment like heart failure. Everything was in order. Everything was proper. But patterns have a way of emerging, even from a landscape designed to conceal them. Alan Massey, the owner of a local funeral parlor, was the first to feel a professional unease. He began to notice an unusually high death rate among Dr. Shipman's patients. They weren't dying in hospitals after long illnesses. They were dying suddenly in their own homes, sitting in their armchairs, often in the middle of the afternoon. Massey also noticed another, more curious trend. An unusually high number of Shipman's deceased patients were being cremated. In the UK, a cremation requires a second doctor to sign off on the cause of death, but this was often a formality, a colleague trusting the word of another. More importantly, cremation destroys all evidence. There would be no body to exhume, no tissues to test. It was a neat and tidy way to close a file forever. Massey shared his concerns with a colleague who dismissed them. Questioning a respected doctor like Shipman was unthinkable, but the unease had been planted. Around the same time, another local GP, Dr. Susan Booth, whose practice was in the same medical center as Shipman's, noticed the same disturbing pattern. She reviewed her own patient data and compared it to the town's mortality rates. The number of deaths attributed to Shipman was statistically staggering. Alarmed, she took her concerns to the coroner for the district. In March 1998, a covert police investigation was launched. It was tentative and deferential. The police were reluctant to aggressively investigate a man of Shipman's standing based on what seemed like statistical anomalies. They conducted a background check, which failed to turn up his earlier pethidine conviction. They reviewed the death certificates Shipman had signed. They all appeared to be in perfect order. They interviewed Shipman himself, who was calm, cooperative, and utterly plausible. He explained that Hyde had an aging population and that he took on many complex cases others would not. To the investigators, it all seemed to make sense. They found no evidence of foul play. The investigation was closed. Harold Shipman knew he had been under scrutiny, and he knew he had passed the test. He had been given a green light to continue killing. This institutional failure, this reluctance to look past the veneer of respectability, would cost at least 3 more women their lives. But with his sense of invincibility now bolstered, Shipman made a mistake. It was not a medical error. It was a simple, fatal act of greed. Kathleen Grundy was a vibrant, active 81-year-old woman. A former mayoress of Hyde, she was wealthy, meticulous, and in excellent health. She adored her doctor, Harold Shipman. On June 24, 1998, Shipman paid her a house call in the morning, ostensibly to take a blood sample. Hours later, her friends found her dead on her sofa, fully dressed. Shipman was called to the scene. He pronounced her dead, told her friends and family she had died of old age, and signed the death certificate. He advised against an autopsy, saying it was unnecessary and would be distressing for the family. He handled all the paperwork. It was another routine death, another sad but expected loss. But then something unexpected happened. Kathleen Grundy's daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff, received a startling letter. It had been sent by a law firm, informing her that a new will, purportedly from her mother, had surfaced. This new will, dated the day of her death, left her entire estate, worth nearly £400,000, to one person, Dr. Harold Shipman. Woodruff was not just grieving, she was a trained lawyer, and she knew immediately that the will was a forgery. It was crudely typed, riddled with errors, and the signature looked clumsy and forced. Her mother, a woman of precision and forethought, had a professionally prepared will lodged with her own solicitors. The idea that she would, on the last day of her life, hastily type anew while leaving everything to her doctor was ludicrous. It was more than suspicious. It was an insult to her mother's memory. Angela Woodruff went to the police. This time, the police had something they could not ignore, a concrete piece of evidence suggesting a crime. The deference was gone, replaced by a chilling new suspicion. They immediately reopened the investigation, now centered on the probable murder and fraud of Kathleen Grundy. The first and most crucial step was to exhume her body. The family, despite their grief, agreed. The autopsy revealed what Shipman had been so careful to hide for decades. Kathleen Grundy had not died of old age. Her tissues contained a massive, lethal dose of diamorphin, medical-grade heroin. It was a drug Shipman had access to, a drug that could mimic the symptoms of a fatal heart attack, and a drug he had a history of abusing. The perfect murder weapon. The discovery blew the case wide open. If he had murdered Kathleen Grundy, how many others were there? The investigation expanded exponentially. A grim inventory of death began. Police identified a group of 15 recent female patients who had died under Shipman's care in circumstances similar to Grundy's. One by one, they sought permission from families to exhume their loved ones. The quiet churchyards of Hyde became crime scenes as caskets were raised from the earth. And one by one, the toxicology reports came back with the same horrific conclusion: lethal levels of diamorphine. Investigators seized Shipman's computer. What they found was a digital-age murderer's diary. He was meticulous in his record-keeping, but he was also arrogant. Forensic analysis showed that he had altered his patients' medical records after they had died. He would go into their files and add symptoms and conditions they never had, retrospectively creating a medical history that would justify their sudden death. A patient who was healthy one day would, in the digital record, appear to have been suffering from chest pains or heart trouble for weeks, all entries made by Shipman after he had already administered the fatal injection. The police arrested Dr. Harold Shipman. He was charged with the murder of 15 women and 1 count of forgery. The trial, which began in October 1999, was a quiet, clinical affair, a stark contrast to the emotional horror of his crimes. The prosecution, led by Richard Henriquez QC, laid out the case with methodical precision. They presented the exhumation evidence, the toxicology reports, the forged will, and the damning computer records. They painted a picture of a man who used his position of ultimate trust to prey on the vulnerable, a man who played God, deciding when his patients would die, and then meticulously covering his tracks. Shipman himself was a picture of professional arrogance. He took the stand in his own defense, appearing calm, confident, and often condescending. He denied everything. He claimed the diamorphine in his victims' systems was for pain relief, even though many of them had no recorded history of needing such powerful opiates. He had an answer for everything, but offered no real explanation. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no flicker of humanity. He sat in the dock like a man observing a tedious academic debate about his work. The jury saw through the facade. On January 31st, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, they found Harold Shipman guilty on all 15 counts of murder and the count of forgery. The judge sentenced him to 15 concurrent life sentences and recommended he never be released. He told Shipman, "You have finally been brought to justice by the verdict of this jury. I have no doubt whatsoever that these are true verdicts." The conviction was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a national reckoning. The question on everyone's mind was, how did this happen? How could a doctor murder his patients one by one for over 2 decades without anyone stopping him? The British government launched a massive public inquiry, the Shipman Inquiry, to find the answer. The inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, was one of the most extensive in British legal history. It examined thousands of documents, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and painstakingly reviewed the cases of every patient who had died under Shipman's care. The final report, released in 2005, was staggering. The inquiry concluded that Harold Shipman had not murdered 15 people. He had murdered at least 218. The probable number was closer to 250. His victims ranged in age from 41 to 93. About 80% were elderly women. He was not just a serial killer. He was the most prolific serial killer the modern world had ever known, a man who had killed more people than Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Jeffrey Dahmer combined. The inquiry exposed a catastrophic failure at every level of the system designed to protect patients. It criticized the police for their feeble initial investigation, the coroner's office for its lack of curiosity, and most damningly, the General Medical Council and the culture of medicine itself, which placed a cloak of invulnerability around doctors, making it nearly impossible for concerns to be taken seriously. The inquiry led to sweeping reforms in British medicine. Procedures for death certification were tightened, the monitoring of controlled drugs was overhauled, and the power of the GMC was reevaluated. But there was one question the Shipman inquiry could not answer, the question that haunts the case to this day. Why? Shipman never offered an explanation. He never confessed. He maintained his innocence until the very end. Was it a God complex, a desire to hold the power of life and death in his hands? Was it a twisted, self-appointed form of euthanasia, a belief that he was ending the suffering of the elderly, even when they weren't suffering? Was he simply reenacting the death of his own mother, whom he had watched die of lung cancer when he was a teenager, her pain eased by morphine administered by a doctor at home? Or was he, at his core, simply a predator who had found the perfect camouflage? We will never know. On January 13, 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used his bedsheets to craft a noose. He took his secrets with him, leaving behind only a legacy of betrayed trust and hundreds of grieving families. His final act was one of ultimate control, a denial of any further investigation into his mind. The friendly family doctor who made house calls had made his last, and in doing so, ensured that the door to understanding his darkness would remain forever locked. The shadows lengthen, and our folio of cases draws to a close for tonight. We have journeyed through the sterile corridors where trust was betrayed, where the oath to do no harm became a hollow echo. The stories of Dunch, Swango, Jones, and Shipman are not just cautionary tales. They are profound and unsettling explorations of the darkness that can hide behind a healer's mask. They remind us that systems, no matter how well-intentioned, are only as strong as the people within them, and that true vigilance is the price of safety. The line between a tragic error and a deliberate act can be as thin as a razor's edge, and sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones we invite into our lives, believing they have come to save us. Sleep well if you can, and try not to think too much about the hands you place your trust in. We'll be waiting to open another file with you again very soon. Good night.